Our next reader, he will be sharing with us something that will be an upcoming episode on his Ancient Light series on YouTube. Let's give a big round of applause for Stephen Dotson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, James. I only have 5 minutes, so here we go. Professor Dotson's mythologically accurate Amazonian Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman hit movie theaters Friday night. The hero, Diana, is an Amazon warrior with an assortment of tools. Bracelets which repel bullets, a magical sword, shield, and her lasso of truth. In the following weeks, you will hear from critics about the movie, but now you will hear from a history professor who has written a narrative to help listeners engage in a more historically accurate Amazon Wonder Woman in fewer than 5 minutes. Feel free to close your eyes to help put yourself in the scene. You are transported back in time to what is now the gallbladder of central Turkey. You became separated from your caravan and follow a half day behind. The road seems to stretch endlessly as the day drags on, when suddenly you feel a rumbling under your feet and a great battle cry from behind. You turn and see a horseman charging in your direction. As the rider nears you, you notice the bow made of multiple pieces of wood, bound by leather. It is drawn. You then see that the rider is dressed in leather armor and wearing pants with tassels that flap in the wind. A foreigner for sure. For no patriotic Greek would be caught dead or alive wearing pants. The horseman looks like a nomadic Scythian from the northern steppes. You put up your hands in surrender. A very good call. The rider notices you are in a passive position and slows. You realize, to your astonishment, that the rider is a very rugged-looking woman. Her skin is rough and brown from her days riding under the sun. Some of her front teeth are either missing or chipped. Her nose is bent and broken. She motions for you to turn, and she binds together your wrists. She speaks a crude form of Greek as she commands you to move this way and that. She says her name is Battle-Worthy, and she is an Amazon warrior. You grew up hearing about her tribe of female warriors, and as you sit on the ground bound by rope, she searches through your belongings, takes all your money and wine. She drinks some of the wine and becomes very confident. She begins to show you some of her scars. She unties her leather chest piece as she smiles at you like some crazed predator. Amazon, she says, and shows you the right side of her chest. Only there is no breast, but a scar where she had been burned when she was very young. She gestures as if she is using a hot poker, making the sound. Tss. She seems very proud of her scars, like any warrior would be with his friends having wine. She mounts her horse as if she's going to ride away and says, "Are you watching?" She goes away down the road, then turns. She kicks her feet and rides fast toward you. You see her draw her bow in the distance. She begins making motions with her right arm, and soon after you see arrows whizzing in front of your face. Your heart is pumping rapidly as finally the Amazon stops in front of you and dismounts. She stands over you, breathing hard, but smiling hard too. "Count them for me," she commands. You turn and see the arrows sticking out of the tree next to you. You begin to count. "Out loud," she shouts. You begin counting again, this time audibly. You are astonished to find that the arrows total 6. Her skill with the bow is a marvel indeed. Better yet, a wonder. After a few more feats, the Amazon woman grows bored with you and begins to depart with your belongings. Before she leaves, she says, "I let you live because you surrender." She gives you another broken-toothed smile. "But you are too small and weak to take as a husband, so goodbye." She turns on her horse and rides into the dusk. You feel somehow honored and emasculated at the same time. Thank you.
Ancient Light.
The previous segment was a live recording from a spoken word event I often attend in my hometown, known as SpoFest. I planted a joke in the fiction narrative for comic book fans. Let me know if you caught the reference in the comment section below. This historical, or at least mythological, Wonder Woman of the ancient Greeks was impressive. The Amazon would have been skilled in elite horsemanship, but most notably in the art of archery. She was not only deadly accurate with the bow, but she could rapid-fire arrows as she charged in and then escaped before you would be able to detect her gender. Greek cities employed her type to patrol the city walls as sharpshooters. The Greek sources disagree on many parts, and much is embellished upon, but there are some consistencies to serve as a focus for my fictional reconstruction that you just heard. I will attempt to present those here alongside a description of how the Amazon female warriors were portrayed in the ancient classical Greek world, and the Hellenistic and the Roman. Here is my main argument, though. It is more likely a group of ancient female warriors were horse-riding archers, not infantry skirmishers, an idea which is supported by ancient material and textual sources regarding ancient female warriors. The Amazons were barbarians for sure, but more specifically from a horse-riding tribal community, like so many of the nomadic raiders in the northern steppes. The Scythians were the peoples often associated with this sort of tribal unit, and several sources indicate that the Amazons interbred with their men. The Amazon female warrior's skill with archery was highly lauded, and the Scythians were incredibly elite archers themselves. The city of Athens even employed Scythian archers to patrol their city walls. They could shoot from horseback or from the ground with sniper-like precision. They used a special bow made to create extra tension and therefore more distance and penetration with their missiles. So it's very interesting if you want to look into what their bows were like. Kind of like a compound bow made with separate pieces of wood, even. It was sort of a short bow. So I'll just go through some things that are in the sources that lend us certain ideas about Amazon warriors in the mainly Greek perspective. They, as I said, they were elite horse riders, elite equestrian hunters, and also good at herding. So herding cattle and herding men. The Amazons were great at that on horseback, and they had an elite ability with a bow. So it's interesting, the idea that the Amazon rode on a horse and was an elite archer eliminates some of those assumed physical differences between male and female, doesn't it? The horse gives you so much more. Power, it itself is a weapon. Speed, pretty amazing. Height advantage, which for an archer, that's a big deal. If you have a spear, so much more impact if you were on a horse charging someone than if you were just to use your own shoulder and torso strength. The idea gives credibility to the idea of ancient female warriors. You know, an average-sized female fighting on foot against an average-sized male with the same training might have some theoretical problems. I mean, history shows us that, hey, not a lot of units of female infantry going on there. The horse riding and elite archery skill changes everything, really. Female hoplite warriors engaged in melee combat, not so much. Female horseback raiders on a lightning campaign, much more likely. What's interesting about the archaeology and the idea of the ancient female warrior is that there is archaeological evidence of female warriors. You can't just find a grave, for example, and assume because you find a skeleton that was indeed a female and has weapons around her that she is a warrior. But what archaeologists have found, they don't assume that she's a warrior just because she has warlike goods around her. She'll have many goods around her. But when you see a skeleton with obvious battle wounds and you see daggers that are specially made, which archaeologists have found these daggers that are made just like their male counterpart daggers, but they actually have smaller handles, and they're buried with females with other battle gear. So archaeologists have indeed been pointing in the direction that yes, there were female warriors. Also, within the graves of these ancient female warriors, medals were found that came from many places and stretched all the way to the Central Asian steppes. So what that means is that these female warriors, these graves of these female warriors that were found by archaeologists, had some weapons and ornaments that were from places where we hear of nomads existing, not just in the north, but in the northeast, not too far from modern-day China even. So pretty amazing that we have warriors in, say, modern-day Turkey who came from the Central Asian steppes, which points to, indeed, that they were horse-riding nomads, not hoplite skirmishers or simple infantry troops of whatever empire happened to be in power in Mesopotamia, whether the Babylonians or Assyrians or the Persians. Somewhat independent. Very interesting. I tell you, the biggest wealth of imagery we have of the Amazons comes from Greek pottery. Pottery is special. I've spoken about this in a previous lecture I have up on Ancient Light YouTube, but Greek pottery is great because really you kind of encounter the mythology of the Amazons through the eyes of the Greeks through pottery, because they're illustrating pottery for a particular message. They want to find something interesting, which the Amazon warrior women were very interesting to the Greeks because of how they appeared in literature and various imagery. So on Greek pottery, researchers have found some interesting things. We actually have nicknames that were given to certain Amazons, such as Hot Flanks and Sets the Dog Loose. They had nicknames just like anyone might have, any warrior might have. So I especially like Hot Flanks, a warrior who was proud of her particularly appealing thighs. But also, researchers have found that some of these words are not actually based off root words from the Greek language. They are Greek transliterations. Now, remember that the Greek classical language was based off the phonetic alphabet, not their own ancient way of ascribing letters. And so what the Phoenicians gave the Greeks is the ability to write out sounds. That's what we have today. Our language writes out the actual sound of the word. And so that was a nice technology to have because they could take certain words from Scythians and change them into Greek words. So the title, Sets the Dog Loose, we think that those words perhaps contain a little bit of what the northern barbarian Scythians sounded like, because those words are not root Greek words, some of them. So very interesting there. So that also alludes to the idea that the Greeks were in fact representing very real images of northern raiders, at least. So another thing that's interesting, especially in Greek pottery, you find that the Amazon women are depicted with pants. This might not really stand out as important to many people, but if you're a classicist, you know that the Greeks did not wear pants. If they illustrated or had a character with pants, it meant they were an other. They were something other than Greek. They were barbarian, and often Persian in the classical era. Persian was the, leading power of the East, the big empire on the block. And much of the romance of the classical world of Greece is constantly encountering Persia. So the Persians were the perfect other, and indeed they wore pants. And so we see the Amazons wearing pants. But also keep in mind that the riders of the northern steppes from east to west also had pants of various sorts, very padded pants. And so we really see Amazon women as fierce warriors with Greek pottery, something to be feared, something to be entertained by even, or even maybe something to ridicule. We do see the Amazons in epic literature, like with Homer. We definitely do. We see them being slain by Achilles is one of the main examples, and Heracles slays a good many Amazons himself. Many of you know him as Hercules, but Heracles is the name the Greeks gave him, which is, it's kind of important that you say Heracles instead of Hercules, because Hera is the person he's named after, the wife of Zeus, Heracles, not Hercules. And then in the sources you have, of course, the Greeks were fond of reading literature that portray different cultures and their interesting tidbits. Herodotus might explain something about a culture simply because it's interesting, even though he calls it history. Of course, this came actually about later, is the idea that many people have about the Amazon as having no right breast, either having it cut off, either having the breast cut off or burned, cauterized. So the idea of having the right breast removed or cauterized especially as an infant with a hot piece of bronze. An Amazon woman perhaps is burned on the right side of her chest to prevent breasts from forming. So what does this do for a female warrior? Well, especially if you're right-handed, the right breast, it makes sense to remove, I suppose. Some people say, it makes it easier for an Amazon woman by having no breast. It makes it easier for her to swing a sword and to throw a spear. Okay, well, maybe. If she has large breasts, that might get in the way. Certainly could throw you off balance if you have a rather hefty bosom. But I think mainly the idea of removing the right breast has more to do with archery. Because if you think about it, the pullback isn't so bad, but when you release the bow, if that tight, taut string was to hit an actual breast, that would be quite painful. The breast could get in the way. I imagine most women could tie their breasts up, but would not need to remove the right breast at all. So in the actual classical sources and in Greek pottery, you see Greek women often with two breasts, and sometimes you actually see the right side covered with cloth. So perhaps that legend came about later, during the Roman era, or even the Hellenistic era. Whereas the classical era, maybe they did portray or think of Amazons as sort of binding the right breast down so it doesn't get in the way. But we don't actually see indication of taking off the breast. In my story at the beginning, I did include the idea of the removal of the right breast for dramatic reasons. So it is at least mythologically accurate that an Amazon might have her right breast removed. The ancients did include that in their mythology. And then there's also the idea of the rejection of men. So you have this tribe of Amazons and there are no men. Well, how did that happen? Did they kill them all? Do they just reject men, and just die out and not breed at all? Well, here's what the ancients say. The ancient Greeks mainly, say once a year, but not necessarily bring the man back with them. They would breed, get pregnant, and give birth among their tribe. Okay, so here's the next question. There are two possibilities when you give birth, generally, a male and a female. And so, well, if there are no males, what do they do with the son? Do they leave him out for exposure? Well, the sources say they would give the son back to the father, or to the tribe that the father belonged to, and would keep the daughter if in fact it was a female that was born. So yeah, that makes sense. Very interesting, very consistent narrative there. It kind of explains things. I do believe there are ancient historians who might emphasize the idea that there were eventually men in the Amazon tribal unit if they continued to exist, but perhaps it remained a female-based leadership, and maybe, the Amazons have reoccurred several times and simply the name of Amazon was reappropriated. Some historians, philologists, think that the word Amazon actually comes from the Persian, which means something like to make war. But you can also look at the Greek and say, well, it can also mean something like no breast. But that is fairly muddled, so let's stick with the consistencies as we have been. The rejection of men in the tribe, very interesting. And I think as a modern literary trope, that's pretty great. I mean, there's a wealth of uses for that. And you also have fake Amazons in the sources. You have sources that talk about maybe a wealthy ruler who has a harem of women he calls Amazons and dresses up like Amazons, but indeed their skills do not lie in warcraft. So that's interesting. So one thing that shows, and I think should be pointed out, and maybe isn't immediately obvious, is that the Amazon were fairly popular in the Greek and Asia Minor world, if this was the case. For the Amazons to be so strongly thought of in mythological terms that they would be reappropriated so many times and become such a consistent factor in Greek literature for so many years. And also, something you might take away is because we kind of think that the Amazons were horse-riding raiders who were good with the bow. Well, these peoples in the steppes were also cattle breeders. Yeah, that's right, cattle breeders. So Wonder Woman, an Amazon warrior priestess, would have a lot of pride in how many heads of cattle she owned. Not like a Greek wife, how much textile could she produce in a year. Perhaps the noble Amazon woman would be judged more on heads of cattle. So they were transporting cattle into different places, monitoring them almost like shepherds, but, also functioning as hunters and raiders. Raiding season comes about, you head out with the other warriors, and you go and pillage a village and cause terror and take things like grain and slaves and whatever wealth and assets you can get away with. Raiders of the northern steppes in general. So if you have any questions for me or comments, please leave them below. There you go. Thanks for tuning in.